Welcome to Continuing Education Module, Wellness Stakeholders, Understanding the Key Players and What They Want from Wellness. The agenda for this module includes our definition of major internal stakeholders and a listing of those and their primary interests, the major external stakeholders and their primary interests, some issues around stakeholder relationships and strategies to enhance those, some implications for wellness practitioners, and a summary of main points. Let's start with some definitions, and our definition of stakeholder is any party that has an interest and or role in any aspect of a business or organization. So we are applying it to the context of a business or organizational setting, and we're essentially saying you've got people that have interests and roles internally and externally. The internal stakeholders are many, and the more organizational size you have in terms of numbers of employees, you can see the categorization below 25, 26 to 99, 100 to 499, 500 to 2500, 2501 to 9999, and then 10,000 plus. So our categorization is very small for the lower than 25, small for the 26 through 99, medium size or mid size at 100 through 499, probably mid size for the 500 through 2500, and then as you get beyond 2500, we're really looking at the larger organizations. The 10,000 plus are going to be very large organizations. And what we've done is give you a highlight of the yellow being the ones that are your primary internal stakeholders, including employees plus their spouses, the HR manager, the CEO, the CFO, and other senior managers. Those are going to be your primary internal stakeholders. As you can see, the kinds of categories that are also listed down the left-hand internal stakeholder column actually increases as the size of the organization increases. So it isn't necessarily as fixed or as mechanical as you see on this chart, but the idea that as you get larger, you get more people with specialized portfolios or responsibilities, and those individuals then start to have their own programmatic concerns. So that as we think about them from a wellness perspective, the group that is in the yellow is our primary focus. Our secondary focus is in the rest of the people, depending on the size of the organization that we're working with. Now, our external stakeholders, again, are by size of employee organization. We've tried to give you an idea of what we believe are the primary external stakeholders. So you see those as the insurance broker, a benefits broker, local hospital vendor, a wellness vendor, and perhaps a health plan. Now, that wellness vendor would be an external organization that's doing some wellness activities for you. Again, you can see the external stakeholders as you go down the list, the column on the left-hand side. You can see more of the detail and the fact that many of those specific functions are associated with larger organizational settings. So this again gives you a fairly complete view of the primary external stakeholders as well as those that might be involved in larger organizational settings. Now, the most important internal stakeholders we're going to focus on first, and those are your employees and spouses, the HR manager, the CEO, the CFO, the Chief Financial Officer, and other senior managers. They may be COO, the Chief Operating Officer. They may be plant managers or regional managers or division managers or strategic business unit managers, but they are your other senior managers. And they are your most important internal stakeholders. Now, when we attempt to overcome some of the objections of the more important and most important stakeholders, internal stakeholders, if we take our stakeholders and we list them by the types we just covered, and we had objections as follows. These are oftentimes some of the objections that our key stakeholders have. So I'm going to go down and essentially list for you what your answers might be. you need to be able to have in your own mind a response to some of these objections. But I'm going to give you what I would say if I were faced with some of these objections. For instance, if an employee basically says to me as a wellness program coordinator, it's none of their business what I do on my own time and what I do with my choice of what I eat and exercise and stress and so on and tobacco and whatever. And I guess my response back to them, if I were in that situation responding to them, I would say that's great, but your behavior has all kinds of consequences, health consequences, and your employer is paying for those consequences. Would you rather cover all of your health care costs yourself and not have a health plan that's provided by your employer? So I would probably come back to them with a question. When somebody makes an objection, I find one of the best strategies is to have a question for them. So then they can kind of deal with that. Would you rather, just do whatever you want, but fine, just pay for it? Maybe their objection is, I don't trust them. And then I would probably ask them, do you know that that you're actually protected by federal and state laws? In most jurisdictions, states have laws that parallel the federal laws around the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act and other privacy and confidentiality and effects of those activities between employer and employee, and that they have criminal and civil penalties. Why would you not trust them? You have laws that you can use to actually punish them. So why should you be concerned about that? Their interest is in you being healthy. Why wouldn't you align with their interest? So what evidence do you have that you don't trust them? That would be another part of the response. Why should I care would be another objection the employee might have. And I would then have to say, well, do you care about your own health? Do you want to have a lot of disease? Do you want to live fairly short period of time? Is that consistent with what you are concerned about? What about your family? What about the impact of your health and your health choices on your family's future? What about your future? Do you care about those? And a little aside, if they don't care about that stuff, then they're probably not good employees. So you probably would want to kind of bring that in if that was, showed up to be a fairly rigid position on the part of a low employee stakeholder. And then these same objections can also be for spouses, and they would have similar responses. I would probably do some of this in the form of an a frequently asked question kind of list, an FAQ list, where I would take some of these issues and then respond in a couple sentences or a couple paragraphs to help somebody sort through their answers. If my HR manager said, we don't really need this wellness program, I would probably then say, well, how important are our employees to our company's future? Did you know that if you don't do anything to help people, they will gravitate from low risk to high risk and cost a lot more and have a lot more health problems? So I would challenge the HR manager to think about that. If the HR manager said, we don't have any budget for this, I would say, well, how much are you currently spending and how much is your company spending on employee health? Do you know what categories that includes? And that, by the way, should be our 5 areas: health plan costs, sick leave absenteeism, workers' compensation costs, short and long-term disability, and presenteeism costs. And I probably would say to them, do you know that there have been studies that show that that's almost $37,000 per employee per year? Are you concerned about the ability to save $37,000 or a portion of it in terms of doing something like a wellness program? Does that make economic sense for us? So that's what I would kind of counter with. If my CEO said there's too much going on, we can't do this wellness effort, and I probably would say, well, Do you know what employee health is currently costing us? And do you know that in some studies it's been as high as $37,000 per employee per year? Is that important? How does that play out in the prioritization process of what we're doing on and what's going on here that is keeping us from engaging in wellness? If my CEO said, I can't measure it, I don't feel comfortable with doing something that can't be measured, I probably would say to them, well, you should know that there's a wealth of metrics that can guide wellness activity. We can look at a whole slew of metrics. We can choose what our goals are, which then translate into metrics, which translate into targets, behavioral targets, which translate into interventions. So we have actually a whole model of wellness called results-driven wellness that allows us to measure our efforts and to learn and to improve things by looking at what the metrics are telling us. If my chief financial officer said, let our health plan do it, they've already got wellness resources, I would probably want to say, well, how many people are covered by our health plan? And how many health plans do we have? And do you think our health plans are really incented to do a good job and keep people healthy? Do they have that incentive operating to give us the lowest possible cost? I would then also ask, do you think they can do this job of helping people change their behavior and their attitudes alone without our involvement? Is this something we can do without, or they can do without having any cooperation from us? And I think that they would probably recognize, no, it's not going to happen without our cooperation. Maybe the CFO comes up with the objection, well, these programs don't work. I've heard about that. I've read something. I've gone to a session and I heard some guy talking about this. And then I would have to ask the person, how diligent have you been in examining the evidence? Are you taking advice from someone who has a bias and has an axe to grind, is an ideologue? And what about the Harvard studies that have been done, a meta-analysis of the effects of these kinds of programs that show almost 6-to-1 ratios of cost-benefit across 20 more actual examples of programs? So I would want to bring their attention to some of those things that have been done that really speak to the issue of what can these programs do. Not that my CFO is going to hold the opinion that I can do it any way I want and produce all kinds of results. You want to dissuade him or her from believing that, because it is how you do it. It's how well are my goals articulated, and what are the targets I am looking at in terms of affecting behavior change or bringing about behavior change, and what are the interventions I'm using to achieve those, and what are the metrics that are essentially telling me how well am I doing. So I would want to kind of bring that logic into the discussion in responding to that particular objection from the CFO. If there are other senior managers, they may have some of the same objections the CEO and or the CFO have, but one of the other senior managers might say, well, employees won't like it. They won't like us dealing with their health. And then I would probably ask them, have you polled them? What evidence would lead you to believe that they won't like it? Do you know of a specific portion of our population, of our employees, that have said they don't want it? And I would then point out to the individual manager that usually 70 to 80% of employees think very favorably about a wellness program. Is that a good enough response for employees to overcome our thought that they might not like it? So in general, you need to come up with your own answers for what you would say, and it needs to be on the top of your head. But I would also suggest that you use questions as a way to get back at the underlying attitudes, perspective, the source of evidence that people have allowed to shape their opinions around their objections to wellness. So here are some suggestions for you related to overcoming objections for those most important internal stakeholders. Now, working with key stakeholders usually means understanding their key values, the hot buttons that they're responding to. So I need to know what is it that they are concerned about. And I need to meet oftentimes to explore their needs and interests. So any stakeholder that is an important stakeholder for me that I determine is probably important in the program's future or success, I want to be able to explore some of those needs and interests that they have. I also want to categorize their go-forward relationship. I want to decide, is this a person I should be meeting with on a quarterly basis? Is it somebody that I can have a lunch or coffee with, once or twice a year and essentially stay in touch with them? So you need to categorize their go-forward relationship around wellness. And then the fourth issue that we generally want to deal with in terms of stakeholders is asking how you can assist them. So if you basically, as the wellness program coordinator, say, how can we make the wellness program better serve some of the things you want to accomplish? So that kind of cooperative perspective, my experience has been, usually leads back to them cooperating more with you. Also, you want to listen and reflect. You want to begin to think about what is it that's driving them. What, they've said this particular thing. What does that mean? What do I need to clarify with them? What do I need to help them, ask them to help me understand what their perspective is? So I need to be able to listen and reflect what the stakeholders are saying. I need to also map out relationship desired endpoints. So I want to kind of know, now, what do I want from the benefits manager? I want that person to be able to build wellness into our benefits. I want them to be able to provide information. If we're going to do a claims analysis at the end of the year, if we're going to have some activities emphasized in terms of expanding our benefits toward wellness and wellness reimbursement. So I want to map out those desired endpoints with the key stakeholders. And I want to follow through on whatever my plan is for them. I want to kind of sketch this out, to keep it simple, but also come back to it. So I have found that I usually can do better if I put a trigger or a task on my Outlook or my calendar for the downstream timing. So, 3 months from now, I put a little note in there. I need to call back the EAP manager and talk with her about how's this going and what's going on in the wellness program where we can do some things to support each other. So I want to use that kind of device as a follow-up device to make sure that I follow up on these relationships that are key to the success of my program. Now, the major stakeholder relation strategies there's 7 of them, and I want to decide which of these strategies makes the most sense with my most important stakeholders. And I have to choose what those are. In the larger organization, I've got more stakeholders to deal with. So I want to use some of these strategies selectively to keep my stakeholder relations good. First of all, regular reporting. So there are some stakeholders, that's what I'm going to do. I'm also going to have some periodic contact and briefings with some of them. Another strategy is I want to be on a group that they're on. So there may be a human capital enhancement group that is at the corporate level, and several of the people that I want to be working with are on that advisory group. So I may establish that relationship and maintain it that way. Sometimes I may want to have a strategy of let's get under the unified chain of command. I want my manager to become the manager of the other areas, or I want a person that sees wellness in a strategic way to actually have a chain of command over other areas in terms of those people that maybe haven't been very cooperative. And I want to work on increasing their level of cooperation by being able to have a unified chain of command. I also might want to use some special purpose reporting. So maybe if I know that the EAP person is really interested in a particular kind of issue, I want to report back to them some of the question sets that come out of my HRA so that they in fact see what's happening in the population from that data. So there may be some special purpose reporting I do with some of my stakeholders. There also may be some selective resource sharing. So maybe I have some resources, maybe they're rooms, maybe they're catering activities, maybe they're web-based or on-site or online, or they're email chains, or there's something that I can in fact use selectively to help my relationship with those stakeholders. And finally, the idea of vendor summits. Sometimes there's an opportunity to bring together the people who are doing wellness, particularly in large organizations, in a vendor summit context so that they get a chance, and perhaps you then strategically invite some of your stakeholders to listen to those vendors and actually develop relationships with them. So that would be a situation where that particular stakeholder relation strategy might be of interest. So these are our 7 core strategies. And then now let's look at some of the recommended internal strategies for stakeholder relations. And we want to look basically at the most important internal stakeholders, which include employees, the HR manager, the CEO, the CFO, other senior managers. And you basically want to see that strategy number 1, strategy number 2, and number 5 are probably our best long-term strategies for these particular internal stakeholders. And if you look at the rest of these, you will see some patterns emerging. And the idea is that in larger organizational context, you want to solidify, consolidate the strategies to make it easy for yourself administratively, but also to make it efficient for you in terms of stakeholder relationships. So from the context of what we'll be talking about in a moment, the first strategy is the strategy that deals with the regular reporting. Then there's obviously the briefing activities, and then some special purpose reporting that is likely to also be a good stakeholder relations strategy for you. Now, the recommended external strategies are as follows. We have those the major ones: the insurance broker, benefits broker, the local hospital vendor, the wellness vendor, health plans. You see again the regular reporting, some special purpose meetings and relationships that picks up on your special purpose types of reporting, and then into the last 2 strategies, which we'll cover in a moment. But then you can see again some of the suggestions that also affect some of these more rare types of external strategies, depending on the size of the organization that you're working with. Now, how to use these tables? First of all, you can identify your key stakeholders. You want to do that. Secondly, you want to decide who needs immediate attention. What are the ones that need to have something now or something in the immediate future? You then want to stratify those key stakeholders by your strategies. And the strategies, again, we've covered in a previous slide, but you want to identify what are the strategies that I want to use with those particular stakeholders. Then you want to set up an efficient administrative process so that you have a way of being able to feed things to these groups and or meet with them periodically and or use other strategies at will. And then implement and move forward. So that's how we're suggesting to you that you use the tables you've just seen to look at your own situation. You could take those, by the way, print them out, and then put a check mark next to the ones that you feel are important for you. And then look at what strategies make sense from the charts, and then come up with, in a sense, an efficient administrative way to respond and to build relationships with those stakeholders. Now, summary of key points. Our key points are stakeholders are either internal or external. The larger the organization, the more stakeholders you need to deal with. Some stakeholders are more important than others, so you do have to prioritize the stakeholders that you're going to be dealing with. Some stakeholders may be negative to wellness efforts. So there are definitely stakeholders out there that are not going to hold a supporting view toward wellness, and you will find those out as you roll out your programs. The wellness staff need to understand the possible major objections of key stakeholders and have a response for them. And wellness staff need to have answers to those major objections on the top of your head. Not, if you happen to get them or if you need to respond to them thoughtfully, you may choose an email to do that. So then you have to decide, do I want to address this issue by email, or do I want to respond in the current situation, current conversation? You want to use program downtime to meet with major stakeholders. So at the times when you're not doing a lot of programming and involved in the programming effort, then that's the time that you generally want to hold for meetings with some of those key stakeholders. And you want to stratify the stakeholders by their major strategy. So the stakeholder relations management strategies that we looked at in some of the charts and the tables that we just covered, those you need to stratify your stakeholders by those strategies. You want to look for administrative and procedural efficiencies. So if you can do a report that is a either bi-monthly or quarterly or monthly report, and then circulate that to as many of the stakeholders as you can, that's an administratively efficient way to keep those relationships good and working for you. You also want to stay aware of new or re-emerging objections from key stakeholders. And you want to keep an open door kind of policy with people. Just say, if anything changes, I know you're in support of the wellness effort and I appreciate what you've done so far. If anything changes, please let me know. So this again would be a summary of some of the key points for this particular module. Now let's answer some key questions. And our first question is, how can I find out the actual interests and concerns of my own stakeholders? And the methods that I would use is you want to ask them. You want to talk to them. You may want to give them an opportunity to provide you with some formal feedback. It may be informal, but you may want to have a trial balloon of something you're thinking about doing, or a write-up of a change in program model, or whatever it is. But then you want to be able to ask them, what do you think about this? And you also want to have some regular contact with the stakeholders that are really important to your operations as a program. So you want to be able to have that and handle that. The second question is, once I know the interests of stakeholders, what do I do with the information? And I believe what you want to do is you want to categorize it and look for patterns. So you want to develop for those patterns and those categorizations, you want to develop some procedures for how you're going to stay in touch with those stakeholders and or address any issues, new issues which come up from them. And then you want to follow through with those procedures that come from the categorization of interests in your stakeholders. And finally, third question, how often do stakeholder interests change? And I probably would say not often. But you need to create the open door opportunity to encourage them to come talk to you if any issues change with a particular stakeholder. There may be budget competition issues. There may be a change in vendor, or vendor personal relationships get dicey. So there's all kinds of things that can happen. You simply want to have an open door kind of policy with them so that they feel like they can come talk to you about what their experience is. And I believe you also want to establish a mutual help, a mutual cooperation kind of a pattern with them. So that's what you want to give them permission to do, and you want to have permission to assist them where possible. And you want to then keep your supervisory staff aware of some of the cooperative work you're doing. because that basically is usually something your managers are going to feel good about, that you in fact are working together. So that's the context for some of these key questions about stakeholder relationships. Now that you've completed this module, go ahead and take the quiz.